Psalm 88 is universally acknowledged as the saddest song in Israel's songbook. Of all the psalms, it stands out as the saddest. As we think about this song tonight, the song was written by one named Heman, the Ezrahite. Don't know exactly which Heman was behind this psalm. Perhaps it was the one in David's day who was a singer appointed by David. Or maybe it was the sage that lived during Solomon's day. Maybe he was the penman of this psalm. Either way, it's interesting. If it was the singer, then we have a hard time understanding the sadness of this song, because singers are known for their joy. If it was the sage, then again we have a hard time understanding how he could be the penman of this psalm, because in this psalm he stands in great confusion, not understanding why this has happened, not understanding why God is not answering, why God's not responding to his cries. Either way, it's interesting. I'm reminded of a much-loved poem in American history. You may remember Casey at Bat. You may remember the story of the Mudville baseball team and how that the game was not going their way, but they were in the final inning and they had an opportunity yet to win the game. The first batter struck out. The next two batters they did not have a great deal of confidence in, but somehow they managed to get on base. The opportunity was there for mighty Casey to knock them in and to win the game. And you remember that Casey stood at the plate? He allowed one strike to go by. Then he allowed another to go by. And finally the pitch came. And as the story goes, Casey took a mighty swing. But Casey struck out. And so the poem ends. So somewhere in this favored land, the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. And somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out. And there is no joy in this psalm. You'll search in vain to find joy in this psalm. It just isn't there. The psalm begins and ends on a sad note. But there's a reason for that, and we'll see that hopefully by the time we get to the end of our study tonight. I want you to understand in Psalm 88 that Heman, he faced a number of problems in this psalm. They're problems much like the problems that we face, and perhaps we can relate to what he was going through. Most of us don't face all of these problems at once, but we face these problems individually at various times within our lives. Consider what he says, beginning in verse 3. He says, "For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draweth nigh unto the grave. I am counted with them that go down into the pit. I am as a man that hath no strength." Here he speaks of the weakness that has fallen upon him. He doesn't have any strength. He is so burdened, he's carrying such a heavy load that it has deprived him of any strength. He can't stand anymore beneath the load that he has to carry. Notice his loneliness, beginning in verse 8. He says, "Thou hast put away mine acquaintance far from me. Thou hast made me an abomination unto them. I am shut up, and I cannot come forth." Then in verse 18, he says, "Lover and friend hast thou put far from me, mine acquaintance unto darkness." Not only was he faced with weakness, he was faced with loneliness. Notice in verse 9 that he was faced with sadness. "Mine eye mourneth by reason of affliction." He was faced with sickness, evidently in verse 15. He says, "I am afflicted and ready to die from my youth up. While I suffer thy terrors, I am distracted." Many believe that the psalmist here is faced with the disease of leprosy, and that's why he's been cut off. That's why he's been separated from lover and from friend and from others. Perhaps that's the case, but there was some sickness, evidently, that he was enduring. He was faced with fearfulness. The latter part of that verse says, "While I suffer thy terrors, I am distracted. Thy fierce wrath goeth over me. Thy terrors have cut me off." We see all of these problems that he faces within this psalm. But the darkness of this psalm seems to be unending. The very last word in this psalm, if you'll look at verse 18, is darkness. The psalm begins in darkness and it ends in darkness. It is dark from beginning to end. Now, as we've studied the Psalms, we've kind of gotten accustomed to something. The Psalms often start in darkness, but they end in light. They often start with the psalmist in despair, but he ends the psalm in hope, believing that his prayer will be answered, believing that help is going to come, believing that God is going to act on his behalf. And so we've kind of grown accustomed to that, moving from darkness to light. But in this psalm, that just doesn't happen. We don't move to the light by the time we get to the end of the psalm. Notice the way the psalmist feels. It's very graphic language that he uses. Beginning in verse 6, he says, Thou hast laid me in the lowest pit, in darkness in the deeps. Thy wrath lieth hard upon me, and Thou hast afflicted me with all Thy waves. Thou hast put away mine acquaintance far from me. Thou hast made me an abomination to them. I am shut up and I cannot come forth. I want you to think about the pictures that are drawn here. First of all, there's the picture that he's in the deepest possible pit. He's in the deepest hole that he could ever be in. It is not only a deep hole, but it is a dark hole. And notice that he says in verse 8, I am shut up and I cannot come forth. I am in this hole. It is a deep hole. It is a dark hole. And I can't get out of it. I'm confined in this position. But not only that, he compares it to the waves of the sea. Notice he says, in verse 6, he's in the deeps. And then in verse 7 he says, Thou hast afflicted me with all Thy waves. The idea is that the waves of the sea are beating against him. And every time he tries to get up, another wave knocks him down again. Just that idea. That's the sadness associated with this psalm. The darkness associated with this psalm. He doesn't understand in this psalm why he's suffering. He doesn't understand why God is silent. Notice beginning in verse 9. He says, Mine eye mourneth by reason of affliction. Lord, I have called daily upon Thee. I have stretched out my hands unto Thee. He says to God, God, I've called upon You. On a daily basis, I've asked You. I've reached out my hands. I'm in this pit, this deep, dark pit, and I've reached out my hand asking You to help me. Notice he continues. Wilt Thou show wonders to the dead? Shall the dead arise and praise Thee? Shall Thy loving kindness be declared in the grave, or Thy faithfulness in destruction? Shall Thy wonders be known in the dark, and Thy righteousness in the land of forgetfulness? But unto Thee have I cried, O Lord, and in the morning shall my prayer prevent me. He says, God, I've been calling out again and again and again. And every day I feel as if I'm a little closer to death. I feel as if I can't go another day. And yet, there's been no answer. There's been no end to the problems that I'm facing. But in spite of all of this, in spite of the fact that he doesn't understand why he's suffering all these things, and he doesn't understand why God is silent, in spite of all of that, he continues to look to God for salvation. And he continues to lift up his voice to God in supplication, in spite of that. Notice some verses with me. Notice the first two verses of this psalm. He says, O Lord God of my salvation, I have cried day and night before Thee. Let my prayer come before Thee. Incline Thine ear unto my cry. Notice he refers to God as the God, O Lord God of my salvation. He understands that the Lord is His salvation. He understands there's no one else who can save him. He understands there's no one else who can get him out of this pit. No one else can break the darkness. No one else can lift him up. God alone can do that. He looks to God for salvation. Throughout the psalm, he continues to cry, asking God to reach down and to help him, to reach down and to save him. In verse 2, he tells us what's going through his mind. He says, "Let my prayer come before Thee, incline Thine ear unto my cry." He feels as if something is hindering his prayer. He doesn't know what it is, but the only thing that he can imagine is, I'm crying out to God. I'm crying out to God day and night, and yet the answer doesn't seem to come. I only get silence in response. My problems continue to mount, and so there must be something standing between God and me. There must be something that's preventing my prayers. Now later on in the psalm, notice the language that he uses. It's interesting. He says in verse 13, "But unto Thee have I cried, O Lord, and in the morning shall my prayer prevent me." The word "prevent" there, if I understand it correctly, literally means meet me. I say my prayer tonight, and in the morning my prayer meets me. Not meets me in answer, not meets me with the answer before me, the prayer having been answered, but my prayer is still there. It hasn't gone anywhere. It hasn't gotten anywhere. I'm praying, but there doesn't seem to be an answer. Notice in verse 9, he says, "I have called daily upon Thee, I've stretched out my hands." Again and again we see him praying in spite of the fact that there doesn't seem to be an answer. Now I want you to understand that he had nowhere else to go, and he knew that. He tells us in the psalm the loneliness that we've talked about. His acquaintance, they were far from him in verse 8. He had been made an abomination to him. For some reason, they had separated from him. It may be because they considered him stricken of God. It may be because they thought God was judging him and they didn't want to be a part of that judgment. It may be that he had leprosy, and as a result, they were separated from him for that reason. Verse 18, lover and friend, they had been put far from him. And he says that God has done this. Acknowledging that God is all-powerful, he believes that there's something that's standing between him and God, that he's being punished somehow for something that he's done in his life. He doesn't understand it. He's confused about that. But in spite of the fact that he thinks that these things are being brought upon him by God, in spite of the fact that he thinks that there's something that stands between God and him, in spite of the fact that all these things are happening and he doesn't know why, he continues to pray. We have to be impressed. We have to be impressed by the fact that he just doesn't quit. He just doesn't give up. He doesn't pray less, and he doesn't stop praying. He continues to pray in spite of the fact that there doesn't seem to be an answer. Are you familiar with the song, "Where Could I Go But to the Lord"? Interesting song, but it's a song that, at least in some ways, captures the spirit or the idea of this psalm. Consider the words with me. "Living below in this so sinful world, hardly a comfort can afford. Striving alone to face temptation sore, where could I go but to the Lord? Where could I go, or where could I go, seeking a refuge for my soul? Needing a friend to save me in the end, where could I go but to the Lord? Neighbors are kind, I love them every one. We get along in sweet accord. But when my soul needs manna from above, where could I go but to the Lord? Where could I go, or where could I go, seeking a refuge for my soul? Needing a friend to save me in the end, where could I go but to the Lord? Life here is grand, with friends I love so dear. Comfort I get from God's own Word. Yet when I face the chilling hand of death, where could I go but to the Lord? Where could I go, oh, where could I go, seeking a refuge for my soul? Needing a friend to save me in the end, where could I go but to the Lord? Now, I have to tell you at least that the second line of this song I struggle with. I really can't sing that line because I don't think it applies to me. But it applied to the psalmist. It's the very spirit in which he writes this song. Hardly a comfort can afford. I have so many comforts. Maybe you have so many comforts as well. Of all the people who have ever lived on the face of the earth, we're blessed. We have an easy life in comparison to those and other places in the world. In comparison to those who've gone before us, our lives are easy. We don't face the persecution. We don't face the problems. We don't face the poverty. We don't face the difficulties that those of days gone by faced. But the psalmist here certainly found himself in a position where hardly a comfort he could afford. Where else could he look? Where else could he go but to the Lord? And although the problems continued to mount, and although there didn't seem to be an answer to his prayer, he kept on praying nonetheless. And I'm thankful that this psalm begins and ends the way it does, because we live in a day of quick fixes. We live in a day where we expect problems to go away just like that. They don't always do that. We kind of have the idea sometimes I'll pray and everything will be better tomorrow. And we have to pray with confidence. We have to pray in faith. And yet we know that some problems are still going to be here tomorrow. And next week and next month. And maybe even next year. Not going to go away overnight. And it doesn't mean that God isn't listening. It doesn't mean that God doesn't care. We're learning. We're learning like the psalmist to be patient, to be faithful, to continue to trust, to continue to pray, continue to rely upon God, even when life doesn't make sense. We continue to do that. Now, this psalm reminds me a lot of the book of Job and of what Job went through. You may want to turn back to that book. Just as the psalmist in Psalm 88 talks about wave after wave after wave of problems and suffering that comes upon him, that's exactly what happened to Job in Job chapter 1. You remember how the book opens and Job, the position that Job is in? And yet wave after wave after wave of problem began to hit Job. First one knocked him down. He tried to get up, and then comes another, and then comes another, and then comes another. They're just again and again it happens. Think about the context here. In verse 13, there was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. There came a messenger unto Job and said, the oxen were plowing, and the asses feeding beside them. And the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. I want you to think about something as we move down through all of these things that are taken away from Job. And I want you to see that although Satan is afflicting Job and Satan is bringing all these things on Job, trying to overwhelm Job with one thing right after another coming into his life, Satan always leaves one servant. I think that's interesting. You say, well, why didn't Satan take every servant? Wouldn't that have been a greater hit if Job had lost every servant every time? Somebody had to bring the news. Someone had to bring the news to Job, and so a servant was left each time to be the bearer of the bad news. And we see wave after wave after wave. Notice in verse 16, while he was yet speaking, he wasn't even done talking. There came also another and said, the fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Verse 17, while he was yet speaking, he wasn't done yet. There came also another and said, the Chaldeans made out 3 bands, and fell upon the camels, and have carried them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, notice again, not done even telling. There came also another and said, thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in thy eldest brother's house. Behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness, and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Think about as well the order in which these things happened. What was saved to last? The death of Job's children. Oh, the loss of all that Job possessed no doubt brought sorrow to him and had an effect upon him, wave after wave after wave, until finally the big blow comes. Until finally, in one day, all of his children are gone. That's Psalm 88. That's blow after blow after blow after blow. That's the deepest pit that you can imagine. That's the darkest hole you could ever find yourself in. That's a hole that you just can't get yourself out of. But notice what Job does. Then Job arose and rent his mantle, and shaved his head, and fell down upon the ground, and worshipped. Do you know what worship is? Worship is adoring God for who God is. Job had lost everything he had except for his faith. He worships God. Notice what Job says. And said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. Job said, I came into the world without anything. I didn't have a stitch of clothing on when I came into this world, Job said. And certainly at this point it looked as if he was going out in the same way. But he wasn't murmuring about it, wasn't complaining about it. He says, the Lord gave. Everything I had was His. It wasn't mine. The Lord hath taken away. It was His right to do that. It all belonged to Him anyway. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job just kept right on praying, kept right on worshiping, kept right on trusting God in the middle of all of this. I want you to go to Job chapter 13. In verse 15, one of the most amazing verses, I'm convinced, in all of the Bible. One of the most amazing statements I think any man has ever made when it comes to faith. Here's what Job says. Though He slay me, yet will I trust in Him, but I will maintain my own ways before Him. Job says, though He slay me. I'm still going to trust Him. You can't shake my trust in God. You remember what Satan had said in Job chapter 1? He'll curse you. You put a hedge about him. Let me cut down the hedge. Let me take away all of these things and he will curse you. God said, no, He won't. God said, have you considered my servant Job? Job was a man that God recommended. And Job was worthy of that recommendation. And Job shows that in Job chapter 13 and verse 15. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in Him. Do you remember Daniel chapter 3? There are 3 young men that have this same resolve. They are put in a position, their lives are on the line. The king is giving them one more opportunity to save themselves. He has set up a great statue. Everyone is supposed to bow down and worship that statue when they hear certain musical instruments. But these 3 young men won't bow. So the king gives them one more opportunity. Verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now if you be ready, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the image which I have made, well. But if you worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Notice what they say. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. Literally, we're not full of care. Our hearts are not anxious. We're not troubled. We're not bothered. Notice what they say. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. You see the resolve that they have? King, we're not going to bow down to this image. If God delivers us, or if He doesn't, we're not going to bow down to this image. That's Job 13:15, right? Though He slay me, yet will I trust. Even if He chooses not to deliver me, I'm still going to serve Him. I'm still going to live for Him. Even if my problems don't go away, even if my prayers don't seem to be answered, I'm going to keep praying them. I'm going to keep saying it. I'm going to continue to trust in God. Even if the darkness doesn't break, I'm still going to trust in Him. The saddest song in all the Bible has one redeeming note about it, and that is that the singer kept singing because he believed in the God that he served. I want you to do some thinking about what is the saddest song in our songbook. You ever thought about that? There's some sad songs. To me, there's a great day coming. Especially the line about those who aren't ready. That's a sad song, isn't it? But you know what the saddest song is in our books? If you can find a sadder one, come tell me. I'm willing to discuss it at least with you. But I'm convinced that the saddest song in our songbook is this one. You never mentioned Him to me. I don't know of a sadder song in our songbook than picturing that judgment scene with someone standing in line that we know, and that person turning to us and saying, you passed me day by day, and you knew I was astray, yet you never mentioned Him to me. You didn't tell me about the cure that you found. You didn't tell me about the physician that could make me well. You never mentioned Him to me. What a sad, sad song that is. We need to make sure that it is not true of us. That we tell our friends, we tell our co-workers, we tell our family members about Him. That they might be able to sing the song of redemption. That they might be able to sing the song of Moses and the Lamb. Thank you very much for your attention tonight.